Wednesday, January 31st, 2024. And what do you call, as I was saying, is hold on one second, technical. Anyways, it's like I said, it's January 24th, and it is Direct Line Wednesday. Our special guest tonight is candidate for United States Senate for the great state of Maryland, John Teichert. Welcome to the show, and our hosts are Mark Unkefer and Jackie Saxton. Take it away.
I think Dwight needs a nap. All right. Well, John, thank you so much for joining us. I haven't gotten the chance to meet you yet, but I have heard your name all over the state. So it sounds like you've definitely created a buzz. So we'll start with the obvious first question, which is, why in the world are you running for U.S. Senate in the state of Maryland?
Awesome, Jackie and Mark. First of all, thanks for having me. And Dwight, if you're still online, thank you as well. I love my country and I love my state of Maryland. And I'm running because we're headed in the wrong direction. And I have committed myself for the entirety of my adult life to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. And it is my intent in the second half of my life to wrestle our nation and state back to where it belongs. And the first step of that is running for United States Senate in the great state of Maryland.
So you've had a long, distinguished career in public service, and you obviously referenced that in your remarks. And it's probably worth elaborating on that. You have a very impressive background for a candidate.
Well, Mark, I appreciate you saying that. It started as a 17-year-old when I took my first oath of office to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. I happened to do so alongside of a very cute ROTC cadet, Melonie Hall, that's now been my wife for 26 years. And for 33 years, I've supported and defended the Constitution of the United States. I went through MIT, I went to Stanford, I became a fighter pilot in the United States Air Force and flew combat missions in my F-15E Strike Eagle. And then I transitioned to become a test pilot and flew high-risk test missions as an F-22 Raptor test pilot. And then I got into the leadership track that provided me opportunities to command Joint Base Andrews, to command Edwards Air Force Base, to be our nation's senior defense official in Iraq, and then close out my military career by leading international affairs for the Air Force and the Space Force. And I've done so all along with my wife, Melonie, who's incredible. She's a chemistry professor at the Naval Academy. We met at MIT as 17-year-olds. And we've got 3 great kids, 2 girls in college, and a son here in public high school in Crofton.
Well, so you probably have a lot to say on the international affairs going on at the moment. I think another question I've had since seeing your name around is, how did you get the nickname the Dragon?
Jackie, that's an awesome question. You're not the first person that has asked me that. And in my community, your first assignment as a fighter pilot, they accumulate stories about you, and then they give you a name that should sound cool. Dragon certainly does, based on those stories. And all I'm going to say is that it has to do with Zaragoza, Spain, and nuclear weapons. And I've had it since 1998, and it's one of those cool call signs that I wear with a badge of honor.
That's awesome. So, yeah, I mean, let's definitely jump into the international affairs of the day, since that's definitely something I think you'll have a lot to say on. But before going into today's, I want to go back to 2021 with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, because that's something that I think was the domino effect creating everything that's happening now. So what was your take? Obviously, we all agree it was horrific, but what's your take on what happened in Afghanistan and what went wrong?
Jackie, let me go back a little bit further than that. I was the senior defense official to Iraq for our nation from May of 2020 to July of 2021. And it became clear after the election in November that the Iranian-aligned groups in Iraq were salivating at the idea of American weakness under the Biden administration. And sure enough, as soon as President Biden takes over as commander-in-chief, you start to see those Iranian groups push the envelope and test us. And every time we caved to them because Biden was desperate to get back into the Iranian nuclear deal. And then several months later, still in 2021, we see this feckless withdrawal from Afghanistan that does a couple of things that are all negative to American interests around the world. First of all, it takes pressure off of Iran because Afghanistan has about 500 to 600 miles of border with Iran. And now that's an axis that Iran doesn't have to concern itself with. But maybe in a broader sense, our demonstration of incompetence on the world stage and a lack of commitment to follow through for those things that we had committed to previously gave the green light undoubtedly to Putin to eventually invade Ukraine, and then really has just left a mark of our American weakness that has been demonstrated time and again for the last 3 years under President Biden.
So let's turn to Ukraine. This is obviously an issue that has divided many within the Republican Party. It's kind of a fault line issue. What are your thoughts about what the American position ought to be?
It is amazing that Ukraine has hung on against Russian aggression for the last 2 years. They have been resilient, they have been courageous, and they have been supported, rightfully so to some extent, by the United States to a tune of about $110 billion, and by Europe to a tune of about $220 billion. But the key to remember is that the United States has this broad portfolio around the world. So while keeping Putin in check is important, and demonstrating to China, who's watching very eagerly, that America does keep its commitments is important as well, that we must not consider this something that we'll write a blank check for. And it means that we should be more diligent than we have been about transparency from Ukraine and accountability, and then demanding, especially now when we've got an additional war to consider, to see that they've got a strategy and a theory of victory that matches our objectives and that finds a way to resource those that is reasonable and sustainable based on American commitments elsewhere. And again, going back to the idea that it is important to check Putin and to demonstrate to China our strength, but we must not write a blank check, and we must see a theory of victory before we continue to pour the next billions into this war that may never end based on the stalemate that it currently has devolved into.
So what do you say to people, because I see this increasingly on the right, there's a faction of Republicans whose foreign policy has become more isolationist, that we shouldn't be helping our allies at all, and all of our money should be staying within the United States. So what would you respond to those kinds of people with?
I understand their perspective, but we have created an international world order since the end of World War II that is free, open, prosperous, and secure, and that has benefited the world. But most importantly, it's benefited the United States. And just as an example of how when America withdraws or demonstrates itself as weak, that the world becomes chaotic, is the last 3 years. It's a petri dish of incompetence by the Biden administration. And while it's not isolationism, it is the United States cowering in the corner. And these malign actors, China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, fill the vacuum. And it's important to remember that it is in our interest to maintain that world order in a sustainable fashion. And that means America taking the lead and not backing itself away from commitments that ultimately benefit us the most.
So let's turn to the Middle East and specifically Israel and the attack by Hamas on October 7th. How would you evaluate the American response to date for that? Have we been as supportive as we ought to for Israel, or too supportive?
Let me start with Israel specifically, and then I'll talk maybe about the broader Middle East. And specifically, it is important for us to continue unwavering support of our special friend in Israel. And we have done okay at that through the Biden administration, but I'll talk about where we've fallen short in a bit. And Israel has 3 primary objectives. Those objectives are to defeat and destroy Hamas, to regain control of the hostages, and then to deter other attacks from its periphery. And it's drifting towards the important 4th element, which is thinking for the long term, for stability and sustainment of the long term for the benefit of Israel. And I have to commend President Biden for maintaining what is mostly unwavering support to our friends in Israel. Where we've really fallen short, though, is from day one, failing to acknowledge that the root cause of all of this has been Iran. And while we deployed 2 carrier strike groups and we've deployed a variety of other Americans, that we continue to deny the fact that Iran has sowed this arc of instability that includes Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Hamas. And by demonstrating American weakness, in spite of the fact that we've got all the capability in the world, but no will through the Biden administration, it has further enticed Iran to continue to attack us, and Hezbollah to continue to attack Israel, and Yemen to attack the Red Sea, or the Houthis specifically, because America has demonstrated a lack of will And that is really the biggest fault of the Biden administration that has caused an escalation of problems in the Middle East by us demonstrating weakness and not standing up to Iran itself.
So there's been pretty much a stall for a while now in getting more of the hostages out. And it seems like most of the negotiations at this point are being run by Egypt and Qatar, who definitely don't have the best interests of Israel in mind, I would say. So what is happening there? Why is the U.S. not, I mean, obviously, I don't think we have the most competent people over there right now, but why is the U.S. not taking a more active role in making sure these hostages do get back?
Jackie, I think that we are doing more back-channel diplomacy than you see on the news. We've got to be engaged in order to put together a deal that is viable at all. And Israel, by the way, has to be the preeminent factor in making a deal that they will accept and meets their objectives in those 3 to 4 areas that I mentioned earlier. Absolutely, it's heart-wrenching to think about these hostages still being held after 4 months. It's heart-wrenching to consider that terrorist brutal attack on the 7th of October. But there's the balance of objectives in the minds of Israel, and they have to be the ones that ultimately get the veto or the green light to the mix and match of objectives or deals that the world community may offer up to them. And if it's not palatable to them, then it shouldn't be palatable to us as a friend of Israel.
So in the long run, assuming at some point this war is going to come to a conclusion, do you think that conclusion should include a two-state solution, or do you not think that that's a possibility?
There are 2 issues specifically with the two-state solution. First of all, there's a moral hazard there, where if there's a direct link between the Hamas terrorist attack on the 7th of October and them achieving some of their objectives in a two-state solution, then that just entices those terrorists around the world to use the worst means possible because they may believe that ultimately it will benefit them. And then secondly, any solution that comes from the long or medium term from the end of the war in Gaza has to be palatable to the Israelis. And again, we've got to follow their lead and let them dictate the ideas of the terms of a settlement. And if or when they are ready for a two-state solution, then and only then should we support such a thing.
We've spent most of the first, 10 minutes or so talking about foreign policy, but let's shift gears. What are voters actually spending their time focused on?
It's interesting, actually. Foreign policy and international affairs typically rank pretty low in the minds of voters. But just based on the way that the world is becoming so volatile under and through American weakness, it's rising up in its stature amongst Maryland and American voters. But really, the big 4 issues are the economy and education and public safety, and then a combination of border and national security. And there's a lot of overlaps there. But as I've crisscrossed the state from Baltimore City to Garrett County to Somerset County and everything in between, those are the 4 big issues that voters keep coming back to.
So I want to touch on the border first, because as we're watching the exit polls from the first few states who've had their primaries and caucuses, the number one issue, well, most people would expect it to be the economy, has actually been the border, thanks to, Greg Abbott and Ron DeSantis sending migrants everywhere, and now every state is a border state. So what should we be doing about the border? Obviously, what we're seeing now is Biden saying, well, Congress has to give me the power, even though he has the power already. But what do we need to do on day one of hopefully a Republican-led White House and Republican-led both chambers of Congress, hopefully?
Jackie, the first step is to secure the border. Right now, the Biden administration policies and lack of willingness to secure the border has created this multifaceted crisis. It is a national security crisis. We don't know how many terrorists, as an example, how many Hamas terrorists are in the United States because we don't have a secure border. It's a public safety crisis because we don't know how many hardened criminals are in the United States. It's a public health crisis as we see the flow of Chinese-supported fentanyl coming across the border. And then it's a humanitarian crisis. But all of it starts with securing the border to maintain our sovereignty. The Biden administration has been completely unwilling to do that, or even allow states to help do that, which is just mind-blowing. The federal government is failing to achieve or maintain their constitutional responsibilities, and the states are stepping up. And now the federal government is saying that they cannot. That is unfathomable. But ultimately, this convergence of crises is all stemmed from the fact that we don't have a secure border and we have a president that fails to secure our border.
And
it's worth noting that on sort of day one of the new administration, by executive order, essentially the administration's own policy, they made some very significant changes in how asylums would be considered, that, at least in the minds of many, created the green light that encouraged people to come forward. So are there ways that we can begin to address those, that particular legislative or legal challenge?
So part of the problem is that these unsure policies have enticed migrants to find their way to the United States. And so now we don't have a secure border along our southern edge of Mexico. And we've got this mismatch of policies that has enticed people to come here because they know or think that they can get in. And that just exacerbates all of those crises that we just talked about. We need clear, simplified, well-communicated policies that discourage people from making trek to the southern border of the United States. And then we need to secure that border. And then only once we've done those two things can we then think about comprehensive immigration reform that would allow us to consider who to let in and who to allow to stay that is in the best interest of the United States.
So with regards to the people who are already here, there's a video that was playing on the news today of 4 illegal immigrants. I think they said they were from Venezuela, attacking, actually there were 8 of them, attacking 2 NYPD officers, kicking them in the face and assaulting them. And they were all let out on bail, or without bail, within 3 hours of being detained. So what do we do about the increase of crime directly stemmed from those that are already over the border? And there are millions of them.
No, there are up to 14 million of them. And it's interesting as I've traveled around the state, and especially as I've talked to sheriffs, many of whom have already endorsed me and we're rolling out more every single week, that they can very clearly trace crime and public safety problems in their community and drug problems in their community to this feckless policy along the southern border by the Biden administration. That means that now we are carrying the economic and public safety burden that the Biden administration has levied upon every community within the state of Maryland and every community within the United States because of a failure to enforce our laws and keep people from flowing across the border without check.
So let's turn a little bit to some of the other issues that you talked about. We've talked about national security. We've talked about the border. What are your thoughts on the economy?
So right now, the economy is struggling primarily because the federal government is addicted to spending. And what I mean by that is they spend way more than they should. But part of it is also that they try to do way more than the federal government was ever intended to do. It is a massive problem that our federal government decides that an idea is a good idea or a policy is a good idea without rereading the Constitution to see whether that is a federal responsibility or not. And now we have accumulated program upon program that has caused the federal government to be massively bloated. And the result of all of that is runaway inflation that now costs American families more than $7,000 extra a year at the grocery store than existed in early January of 2021. And that is a problem that is compounded by the fact that the federal government, and by the way, the same could be said of Annapolis, taxes more than it should and regulates way more than it should. And now all of that is suffocating the well-being of families and individuals in places like Maryland that are now doubly burdened by an inflation that is out of control, taxes at both the federal and the state level that are unaffordable, and regulation that stifles initiative amongst the American people.
So one of those things, and this will also kind of stifle us a little bit into education, is that despite the ruling from the Supreme Court, President Biden continues to cancel student loan debt that he does not have the authority to cancel. What can be done either to prevent that from following through or to, I don't even know what, to stop that from happening?
No, I mean, it's just appalling that our president has directly gone against the Supreme Court ruling and violated the law in doing so. And he needs to be called on it. We can't just let him continue to run roughshod over the Constitution. We need to censor him at the level of our Congress. And then we need to continue to allow cases to flow to the Supreme Court to double down on the rulings that remind our president that he does not willy-nilly have the right to do things that he think are a good idea. That particularly, that policy requires a Congress to make legislation that is approved to follow through on. And a president just can't do all of the things that he believes are in the best interest of the country. We have a constitutional system and we need to follow that system. And every other branch of government must raise their hand and call the president on his violation of federal and constitutional law.
Now, you've been a critic during the campaign of the omnibus process, the passing of these comprehensive appropriation bills. Why don't you expand on that and maybe describe what you think ought to be the way that Congress and the president should go forward on spending?
It's amazing that we have focused so much on Capitol Hill, on all of these other ancillary issues, and they continue to forget that one of their fundamental responsibilities under the Constitution is to pass a budget. It's embarrassing to consider that sometime within the next few days, it is the responsibility of the president to send to Congress next year's budget. And we continue to not have this year's budget. In fact, 13 of the last 14 years, we have started the year without a military budget, amongst other budgets based on continuing resolutions. And that ends up costing billions of dollars and threatens our national security and the functionality of our government. That our Congress needs to get back to focusing on the few things the Constitution gives them responsibility for, and they need to do those things well. And then and only then should they consider some of those other things that maybe could fall on their plate.
So back to education a little bit, we saw specifically, I believe it was last month, the testimony from, and one of those being your alma mater, but the MIT and Harvard and UPenn chairs, and them just completely blowing it with regards to anti-Semitism on campus. And of course, we're seeing all kinds of other terrible things coming out from college students these days. And I know we talked about the federal government getting involved in over-regulating where they shouldn't. So what, if anything, should our federal government be doing with these public universities?
Well, even private universities, you see some of the testimony of those presidents that you mentioned, and Cornell has come under fire more recently, and they are seemingly morally bankrupt, that they can't even conceptualize some basic things that average Americans understand to be right and understand to be wrong. And the anti-Semitism has been horrific as a stain on our society and an indication of a culture that may be rotten from the inside out. One of the things that very clearly the federal government can do is suspend or curtail federal funding to research programs in those universities when it's clear that the universities are not being led in a way that is conducive to the well-being of all of our society. And again, those institutions that you mentioned should be embarrassed with themselves that they have allowed their academic excellence to be hijacked by a bunch of other things that, again, demonstrate moral bankruptcy.
So let's turn a little bit to your campaign. We've managed to avoid all those handicapping questions that seems to dominate political discussion. That said, it's hard to avoid it altogether. Talk a little bit about how the campaign is going on and the response that you've been getting. And we'll talk about endorsements, but let's just talk generally about the campaign so far.
No, absolutely. Thanks, Mark. And I have been now on the campaign trail for 4 months. And to me, this is a little bit like a wing command or a deployment where it's busy and I'm out and about a lot. By the way, my family fully supports me and we've been serving together from the beginning. But I am crisscrossing the state. As an example, last weekend or 2 weekends ago, I guess now, I was out to the far west and I've been out to the far southeast, and I've spent a lot of time in inner city Baltimore and then down south in St. Mary's County and all of the places in between. But really, one of my fundamental elements of strategy is to get out to where the people are. And that means maybe a church in inner city Baltimore, like I spent last Sunday morning in, or whether it means going to some specific engagements or events in places that normally a senatorial candidate would not go. But I'm doing that very intentionally. Number one, because I started this race with the general election in mind, because it's the only way that a conservative Republican can ultimately gain the traction to win in Maryland. But I also very much enjoy the fact that if I can connect with people face to face, or maybe via electronic medium like we're doing today, then they can get to know me and I can understand their issues. And then before even the defenses go up when they learn that I'm a Republican, they start to understand that we on the conservative side have the solutions to the problems that have been bedeviling them for many decades here in the state of Maryland. And so I'm enjoying myself. This is a lot of work, but it is fun work. And the thing that has surprised me most is how much I enjoy it. But it harkens back to being the wing commander at Andrews or the wing commander at Edwards, where my leadership philosophy is participatory. And I get out of my office as much as I can and squint with my ears with the people and understanding their needs. And then I help them to understand how my solutions or our policies are perfectly suited to meet their needs in those big four areas. And I think we're already gaining a lot of traction, obviously importantly for the primary, but also already sowing the seeds to be well ready for the general election when the time comes.
So thinking through to a potential general election matchup, have you given some thought into, with it being an open seat, who on the Democratic side you think you could be facing?
Yeah, so obviously the big two on the Democrat side are Angela Alsobrooks and David Trone. David Trone has a lot of money, and Angela Alsobrooks seemingly has a lot of support by some of the establishment Democrats. The one thing that is interesting personally for me is that I spent 2 years commanding Joint Base Andrews, which is the largest employer in Prince George's County. So I have deep roots in a very blue county, and certainly those relationships will be far easily more leveraged under a David Trone opponent than it would an Angela Alsobrooks opponent. But either way, the thing that I see happening in their primary is that it's going to be very competitive. They're going to spend a lot of money. They're going to attack one another to some extent. They're going to push each other to the left. And I believe a collaborative conservative candidate, an adult in the room, can emerge from our side. And ultimately, they will emerge from a primary wounded and weak and vulnerable. And that's the opportunity that we have to seize to win in the general election.
So tell me, what has been the biggest surprise if you've been out on the campaign trail, the thing that was unexpected that you've encountered?
I think ultimately, Mark, it is that I've enjoyed this process as much as I have. And again, I love getting to know people. There's 6.2 million people in Maryland. I would love to meet every single one of them. But in lieu of that, I'm doing as much as I can as I travel and get out to where the people are to really, again, get into communities or get around people that otherwise I'd never have an opportunity to interact with, and to build a relationship with them or to understand their needs, so that then I can be far more sensitive to finding ways to solve the problems that Marylanders really care about. But really the surprise is that I've loved this process. I'm just gaining steam. I figure I'm going to be kicking in my afterburners, that's a fighter pilot term, here pretty soon, and really light this campaign on fire in a way that provides a whole lot of thrust. But certainly all of this is sustainable and enjoyable. And I'm just going to continue to enjoy the process through the general election.
So my last question before we turn to the endorsements, and I like to ask this of a lot of our candidates who come on, is what current member of the Senate or Congress do you most identify with in your style, or what you would be your style as a senator?
So I'm going to give you two names, Jackie, because they're two names that I hold near and dear in a lot of different ways. And the first one is Tim Scott. I have been so inspired by America, A Redemption Story, his book. It's the most inspirational book I've read in the last couple of years. And I love the fact that he serves in a way and delivers a message that is hopeful, but also demands needed change in our country. And so I love Tim Scott's style, and I continue to look up to him. He and I had a great conversation last week, maybe more to follow on that in the days and weeks ahead. And then Kevin Kramer from North Dakota is someone that I recently got to know, and he flipped a blue seat red back when he started this journey in the United States Senate. And prior to his flipping that seat red, it had been blue for the entirety of his life. And I just like the idea, though that is a small state, much smaller than Maryland, that here is a guy that understood that in order to ultimately win the seat and serve the people of North Dakota, that he needed to resonate not just with the people on the right, but the people in the middle, and to some extent, the people on the left. So those are the two names of people that I just recently have had great conversations with that continue to inspire and motivate me.
So we talked a little bit, we referenced endorsements. So let's give you the opportunity to talk about some of the endorsements that you've picked up.
No, and I am honored with every single one of these. I did allude to a little earlier a variety of sheriffs within the state that have already endorsed me. In fact, we publicized to the press earlier today 2 additional ones in Allegheny County and then Sheriff Lewis out on the Eastern Shore. And so we highlighted those, but we have this continuing drumbeat weekly of a variety of endorsements. And the law enforcement ones are ones that are near and dear to my heart, because as a military guy, I have a soft spot for other servants to the community and the country. And they certainly fall under that category. And especially because they have been so demonized and maligned by the other side of the aisle, that I think it's a great opportunity while I have a microphone in my hand to praise the work that they do and that those men and women that serve under them do. And so several sheriffs thus far, a few state senators and state delegates. Some of those are friends of mine, and some of those are people that I have met along the way. I was very honored to get Lieutenant Governor Boyd Rutherford's endorsement, and then former Secretary of Commerce Mike Gill as well. I worked with both of them when I commanded Joint Base Andrews under the Hogan administration. And then last week, we rolled out our first House endorsement from the chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee, Mark Green. And I think that you'll see every week or every other week, we'll have a member of the House or a member of the Senate that will roll out as an endorsement as well. And thus far, it's just been a joy to talk to these people who are serving our country and our community in different ways, and then finding a way that we can collaborate. And it actually all goes back to before I launched my campaign. And I made a point to try to travel to every single county in the state. I made it to almost all of them, and sit down and buy a cup of coffee to the GOP county chair and let them know who I was and let them know what I was probably about to do, and then to let them know why and find ways that we could collaborate. I love working with a variety of people to solve problems. And that all started even before I started the campaign with all of those GOP county chairs. And now as we roll out these endorsements, those individuals are advocates for me and advisors to me on the areas that they're specialists in.
So looking ahead to a potential general election, do you think that you would try to get endorsements from any Democrats? Do you think that would be favorable to your campaign?
I think that it would be interesting to find those moderate Democrats that are repulsed by the radical nature of whoever emerges from their primary. And that would just be indicative of the fact that I am somebody that Republicans can vote for and that independents can vote for, but some of those Democrats I can carve off. And that's what's going to be necessary to win this election. And I do find it interesting that as you go around the state, or as I go around the state, that people are frustrated with those items that clearly the left has failed to address in this state or for our nation for decades. And so I do see in the future, in a variety of different levels, some Democrats endorsing me, and that's going to be necessary for me to ultimately carry the day in the general election.
Now, what are the characteristics, I guess the best way to describe it, of these presidential years as well, the top of the ticket? And so let me get your thoughts on the top of the Republican ticket. Currently, obviously, the front runner and likely nominee is Donald Trump. How do you think that's going to impact your campaign here in Maryland?
So those are great questions, and I appreciate it. And I am laser focused on what is happening here in the state of Maryland and those 6.2 million people. But I also recognize that we need to regain control of the White House and the Senate and keep control of the House in order for us to truly spark a conservative movement and wrestle our nation back to where it belongs. And so to me, I am very much focused on what's going on in the state of Maryland. But we do need to retake the White House as Republicans or conservatives. And then at the same time, I want to be a good mutual supporter to those that emerge from the primary season that are running for CD2 or CD6 or CD5 or CD3 that could win races. And I want to be a friend and a wingman and a mentor to them, because I think that people are thirsting for leadership for sure in this state, but also for solutions to the problems that face them every single day. And I want to do that up the chain and down the chain. And then once I get into the United States Senate with my colleagues as well.
So probably the easiest question you'll answer all night. How can people follow your campaign? What's your website? Where can they donate? What events do you have coming up?
Jackie, I love that question. Thank you for asking. My last name is a little difficult to spell. Teichert for Maryland.com, all one word, is my website. TeichertForMaryland.com. There you can find social media. There you can find press releases. There you can find almost daily the national media hits that I've been doing, especially about national security. But you'll see a variety of things there. And then also you can find ways to donate there. And here's the 4 things that I ask people for in priority order. I want people to pray for me. I want people to follow me. I want people to share with their network if they like what they see. And then I want them to donate as they see fit. And you can do all of those things and follow along with our journey to wrestle our nation and state back to where it belongs at TeichertForMaryland.com.
Now, what are the metrics by which campaigns are frequently judged, at least at this stage, is how is the fundraising going along? And I've obviously seen some indications on that. So why don't you elaborate as to how your campaign is doing that way?
Mark, absolutely. I was given a stretch goal by the National Republican Senatorial Committee of $300,000 raised in the first quarter. That was a stretch goal. And they told me that because as you run a campaign, you're kind of on your own for the first quarter until you can prove yourself on your own. And so they basically said that if I could achieve that milestone all on my own, essentially using my Christmas card or friends and family list, plus some other donations that have been awesome grassroots from almost every single location in the state of Maryland. But they said if I could reach that milestone, which I exceeded, then now other doors of support could open up because they would consider me a credible candidate. And so the 2 things that we focused on was name ID. I continue to focus on that, and then raising money in that first quarter. And we've exceeded those milestones, plus engagements, plus endorsements, plus media. And we are going to ride that wave, like I said, so that we can kick in the afterburners now that we've achieved that milestone in the second quarter and beyond, heading into the general election.
Cool. So is there anything else you want to plug or tell us or touch on before we go into our plugs of what's going on around the state?
Jackie, maybe the only other thing is that I'm focused on being a leader, not a politician. That politicians have dug a hole for this country in this state. They're not going to get us out. It requires leadership, and the type of leadership that I've provided throughout my career that has seen mission success in a variety of very difficult areas. And I am bringing leadership to the table. That's not something that my competitors will be able to provide, but I'll provide it. And as I go around the state in Maryland, people are thirsting for leadership, not politics. And I look forward to delivering it to them as their next United States Senator. Excellent.
All right. Well, tomorrow, as you just saw flash on your screen, is first Thursday of the month, which means we will be at Mama Lucia's in Olney at 6:30 p.m. And this month, we're joined by Kate Sullivan, who's going to be talking to us about election integrity. And if you've been following along in the news, there's been lawsuits going on in Maryland about our voter rolls. So it should be really interesting to hear from Kate, who's been kind of spearheading that effort. So definitely come out if you're available. And
just to be clear, I mean, Kate not only is spearheading those efforts, she is the plaintiff in the lawsuit that's challenging the Board of Elections. We'll talk about that more tomorrow. So it really is going to provide an inside view as to the efforts that have been going on to basically reform the way the Board of Elections is being handled in Maryland. Go ahead, Kate.
Yep, that's the big thing to promote from us. And John, thank you so much for joining us. And Mark, as always, thank you for hosting. And now that we're done, what should we do now?
Well, I think that the two of us, or the three of us, should all head out to Melonie's Italian restaurant in Nottingham, Maryland, and have a great Italian dinner. So we'll put that on our agenda.
All right. Thank you guys so much. And we'll be back next week with another guest. Have a great night.
Thanks.